My name's Rick Kamber, and I was going to begin by thanking Chad Redwood for inviting me to this exciting conference. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm a philosopher by training and trade, but my philosophy has gotten to be very concrete over the years. I tend to give more examples than arguments, so I'm going to do that today. So I'm going to talk about knowing a place. And the place I'm going to talk about is Asbury Park, New Jersey. I can't talk about the Central Valley because I got here yesterday and I don't know it. But this is the place I grew up, and I'm going to say a little bit about this in order to illustrate a fairly simple point, but I think an important one. What is it to know a place? I guess for most Americans today, the knowledge that they have of Asbury Park, if they have any, is that Bruce Springsteen jammed at the Stone Pony in Asbury. And that's actually part of my story. But I have a different way of approaching this. I grew up in Asbury, and when you grow up in a place, you know it from the ground up. You know the streets, you know the sidewalks, you know the kids on your block. This was a resort town, and so I spent a lot of time on the beach and on the boardwalk, in the ocean and so forth, and I knew it intimately, aesthetically, if you will. But the question I want to raise is this. I mean, how do we understand a place? And I want to suggest to you that you don't understand a place until you understand something about its history. Not just its political history, but its social, cultural, and economic history. And I guess Hegel and Marx would agree with that. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of Asbury Park. This is knowledge really that I acquired pretty recently. I began to just look into the history of my hometown. And I learned some things from doing that. Asbury Park is located between Long Branch, New Jersey, and Ocean Grove, about a 7-mile distance between those two towns. Long Branch was kind of a strange combination of things. Gambling was big in Long Branch, bars, saloons they called them at that time, but it was also a playground for very rich people, and 7 different presidents of the United States had homes or lived in the Long Branch area. This is General Grant's home on the left. The gambling and drinking part of it is represented by the guy in the middle. He was a tourist in Long Branch named Jesse James. Down to the south was Ocean Grove, and Ocean Grove could not have been more different. It was a Methodist town. It was a religious community. The Camp Meeting Association camped there, and it had a very distinctive character. Even when I was growing up, you couldn't drive in Ocean Grove on Sunday. And for much of its history, it was a very dry town. This gentleman, James A. Bradley, came to this part of New Jersey in the 1870s, and he was fascinated really by the possibility of creating a kind of in-between place, a place that would have some of the characteristics of Ocean Grove, Methodist, dry, but more fun than Ocean Grove, not as much fun as Long Branch. And so he bought 500 acres of land just north of Ocean Grove and created a town called Asbury Park after the Bishop of Asbury. It was enormously successful. Here's a picture of Asbury in 1878. And it was indeed, just as Bradley had hoped, a dry, middle-class resort. It called itself a town without a frown, and it had all kinds of enjoyable and wholesome events. This was the annual Baby Day Parade. Even as a kid, I remember there were still Baby Day parades when people had their babies in carriages and such, and paraded them down the street. Grand hotels and guest houses were built, and one of the things is when you have these big hotels and guest houses and so forth, you need servants. In those days, many people of wealth had servants, and it was expected to have people that washed the dishes and served the food and did all the things that have to be done to support a resort town. And so two towns sprang up within the mile square, roughly the mile, that square mile that composed Asbury Park, a west side and an east side, literally separated by the railroad. So the other side of the tracks, particularly the south part of the west side, became the community for African Americans. And these people had all kinds of jobs, but many of them, worked in the tourist industry. They worked as waiters, or they worked, cleaning rooms and things of that sort. And that became the character, this very segregated character of Asbury Park. It's funny, growing up, I was, kind of aware of it, but not really. It didn't fully impinge on my consciousness that I lived in a town that was as segregated as any town in the South. The area on the west side, particularly along Springwood Avenue, was the center, the business center of the west side. And initially it had, in addition to African Americans, it had Italians and Jews. This gentleman is Danny DeVito Sr. You guys all know Danny. I grew up with Danny DeVito. He was my contemporary. But this is his dad, and they had a candy store on Springwood Avenue. Here's a picture of Springwood Avenue, probably in the 1950s, I think, and it's a parade. This was actually a very vibrant community, and by the standards of the day, reasonably prosperous. Excuse me. But segregation in Asbury Park manifested itself in some pretty ugly ways. Relations between whites and blacks were cordial, courteous, but profoundly unfair. One really vivid example of this is the mud hole. There was a mile of beaches in Asbury Park, but people of color were only permitted on one of the beaches, and this was a beach that was where the sewer system emptied into the ocean. Another manifestation of this was the Savoy Theater. Asbury Park was the home of Walter Reed Jr., who was part of a family of filmmakers and film exhibitors, and he had six different theaters. 6 theaters in a town that's only 1 mile square. And some of them were these grand movie palaces. But only one of the 6 theaters had no restriction on admitting African Americans to the theater. It's called the Savoy. And it was a theater that was closest to the west side. The music scene in Asbury Park was also kind of was segregated in effect by custom, though not by law. A guy named Arthur Pryor was a protege of John Philip Sousa, and he was the great band leader in the early part of the 20th century. And there was a great band shell and concerts that were given all the time. And he was very much part of the white music scene. On the other side of town, there were several places that were jazz in particular, and then later on rhythm and blues and soul music were played. 2 of the most famous were Cuba's. This is Cuba's, picture of Cuba's on the left, and the Orchid Lounge. In these venues, people like Count Basie and Duke Ellington played as young men. And fantastic music. Almost no white person ever went down to listen to this music. They went to the boardwalk, or they went, to the band shell or something like that. Now, it's not the case that there were no black performers. Here's a picture of the great Ella Fitzgerald at the Asbury Park Casino in 1938. But playing to a largely white audience. A strange and rather sad incident occurred in 1956. The convention hall on the boardwalk decided to have a rock and roll concert, and they invited Frankie Lymon, who was quite a star in those days, to come. But it ended in a race riot. And for years after that, no rock and roll was permitted on the boardwalk. Gradually that changed, but Convention Hall later on would have African American musicians, but its character was maybe largely defined by white musicians and by the organ concerts that were given there every Sunday. Bruce Springsteen came to Asbury Park in 1968, and the town was undergoing some changes by that time. Springsteen played at that time in something called the Upstage Club, which was actually, you can see that concrete thing above the shoe store. That was the Upstage Club. It was 2 rooms, a coffee house and a jamming room above an old shoe store. One of the things that Springsteen did was to recruit talent from the west side of Asbury Park. Here's a kind of blurry picture of Clarence Clemons on saxophone at the Orchid Lounge around 1964. Springsteen went over to the west side, absolutely fascinated by the music, and recruited some of the best musicians. David Sancious, for example, was a local boy, and he became part of the E Street Band. In 1970, there was 7 days of rioting in Asbury Park, mostly concentrated on the west side along Springwood Avenue. And of course, you all remember 1968, assassination of Martin Luther King. But that's not when the riots happened. There were no riots in 68. There were no riots in 69. Undoubtedly, there was simmering resentment. But the riots occurred in 1970. Why 1970? Well, it's hard to explain that completely, but part of the reason is that that summer, in the summer of 1970, some of the hotels, the bigger hotels along the beachfront, began giving the menial jobs that they had, the summertime jobs, working in, the back places as waiters or dishwashers or whatever, to white kids from overseas, rather than to local African-American teenagers. And so what you had was now an accumulation of kids without jobs on Springwood Avenue. And on July 4th of 1970, some of these youngsters, really these teenagers, probably just to amuse themselves, began throwing like cans of soda at passing cars. And that spark precipitated riots that lasted for 7 days. Amazingly, nobody got killed. About 180 people were injured. Parts of the town were burned to the ground. And it began, put the town into a tailspin, from which it is really just recovering now. For decades, Asbury Park, this very successful resort, became a very chaotic place. In his new autobiography, Springsteen has this to say. He says, there was some drifting back and forth across the color line in Asbury in those days, but not a lot. The riots changed all that. They made the two communities more suspicious of each other and made a trip to Springwood a lot less welcoming. But they also seemed to throw the more musically adventurous into each other's arms. Strange thing happened. Asbury Park became a center for a time, for a number of years, to a vibrant musical scene. At the same time that the town itself was disintegrating in many ways. Lost its tax base, lots of white flight, lots of black middle class flight out of the town. Nobody really wanted to live there who could afford to live someplace else. Some of the character of Springsteen's music, I think, is influenced by what he saw happening in Asbury during this time, during the 1970s. For example, the song 4th of July, Asbury Park, or alternatively called Sandy, you get some flavor of living in a town that's coming apart at the seams. By the 1980s, Asbury Park was a very strange place. The boardwalk which of course had been sort of the vibrant center of the tourist industry, became a ghost boardwalk. I remember being with some friends. We were in Ocean Grove, and we walked through the casino onto the Asbury Park boardwalk, and it was the strangest thing. The activity, going on in Ocean Grove just stopped. It was a no man's land, and it looked like this. So this is what I've learned about my own hometown. Happily, it's things are getting better. It's coming back, but it took a long, long time. So thank you very much.